Benedicite Dominus. Welcome to question 144 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lecture is shamefacedness, and I am Dr. Thibault. So we are looking at the cardinal virtue of temperance. And under temperance, there are two integral parts, and they are shamefacedness and honesty. Now, usually when you get into these integral parts, again, these are like, if you were to say, well, what is a house? It's the walls, it's the roof, it's the floor. In this way, what is temperance? It's shamefacedness and honesty. So there's only two elements that make up for this entire structure. When you get to shamefacedness, it's very it's unusual because it's not very complementary in some ways to shamefacedness. When you get to honesty, it's all about how wonderful honesty is. When you consider, is shamefacedness a virtue, the first question, usually the objections start with a very clear answer in the negative. So it would say, typically you would expect to say, is shamefacedness a virtue? It would say, shamefacedness is not a virtue, which means then that it is, right? If that's what the objections say. This one is saying, shamefacedness is a virtue, which you go, what? Which means you're going to probably say it's not in the actual answer. And this one, there's always, with shamefacedness, always a distinction. Again, if anybody's looking at this video, I'm talking about this in context of the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas. When I did a Google search, I noticed a lot of the people who discussed shamefacedness were from the Black Protestant churches. So you might be catching this if you're not a Catholic. Welcome, and there's a whole question of it in the Summa, which I will link into the question if you want to read it. Shamefacedness, in some ways, though, is a virtue, and I'm kind of when I'm using these questions, I'm kind of trying to pull out the positive part of it. I could just focus on the negative. Oh, it's not a virtue. It's not. Well, but then what are we left with? Right? What are we left with if I leave it in its kind of negative framing? I think it's useful if I can try to find the positive part of this question, because it is one of those integral parts of temperance. So I think the answer to it, it's all these articles, but when you finally get to it, the 4 articles. The answer is in the last response to the last objection of Article 4, where St. Thomas uses a quote from St. Ambrose. Shamefacedness lays at the first foundation of temperance by inspiring man with the horror of whatever is disgraceful. I think that if you look at that alone, you go, okay, that's the part that's why it's included in here. That's why it's an integral part of temperance. Because what it should do at its heart, the thing that makes it virtuous, is that you shrink away from that which is scandalous, dishonorable, below one's dignity. So you shrink away from that which is below one's dignity. That is at the heart of what temperance is about. Being drunk, just massive amounts of unhealthy food. It's the embarrassment that comes from living that loose lifestyle. That's part that it is the good part, and I think that's the part that Ambrose is capitalizing on, which is good. When we look to Article 1 itself, St. Thomas says, well, it's not really a virtue, which it doesn't actually have to be a virtue to be a part of temperance. Part of temperance doesn't have to be virtue itself, but they usually point in that direction. St. Thomas says, well, first, if you look at shamefacedness as this kind of fear, it's kind of based in fear of being disgraced. It's an emotional reaction. If you were trip over your own feet walking down the street and you get embarrassed. It's really not any virtue in being embarrassed, afraid of being embarrassed. You're afraid that somebody saw you or they taped it and you're going to end up on YouTube, right? That's a fear, but that's how is that virtuous? That's in some sense a sense of pride, right? So in that regard, of just fear and the passions that are not virtues. Therefore, shamefacedness is not a virtue. But then, in a broader sense, he says, this is at the end of his answer, last paragraph part of it. He says, virtue denotes whatever is good and praiseworthy in human acts or passions. So, in that regard, shamefacedness is praiseworthy because it has an impulse, because the impulse of passion is some way of a type of modesty, anyway, right? You see something pornographic and you get embarrassed and you look away, right? That part of it is praiseworthy. Right? There is a praiseworthy element of it coming from impulse, which is dealing with the passions, though, right? This is less virtuous. It's virtuous because it's praiseworthy, but it's not virtuous because it is a acquired virtue, right? In that way, it's different. St. Thomas then says, being, in his response to objection 5, being frequently ashamed causes a habit of an acquired virtue whereby one avoids disgraceful things, right? So if you frequently blush at embarrassing things, lewd things, inappropriate things, you can kind of create this habitus of being ashamed. Wherefore, you can create an acquired virtue out of it. This is you can see the complexity of this. How much do you want to live in the state of being ashamed, and and can you turn being ashamed into an acquired virtue? Because if you're ashamed at something, then you look again, you don't grow in shame, right? Unlike honesty, where if you act honestly and then you act honestly again, and you act honestly again, you actually build honesty by frequency. Being ashamed is kind of the opposite. If you look at something pornographic, you look back, you're a little less ashamed. You look back, you're a little less ashamed. Eventually, if you're staring at it all the time, you're not ashamed at all. So in some ways, to build an acquired virtue of being ashamed is almost contrary to every other way that you build a virtue, which is by repeatedly doing it. So that's kind of an interesting perspective. But you can see why this is a complex, integral part. It's not really like the others we've covered. So, Article 2, shamefacedness is about a disgraceful action. So, it's about fear of doing something disgraceful, or a disgraceful deed that has been done, according to Damascene. So it's about the present or the past. You don't want your past to be brought up, or in the present moment, you're afraid that you're going to embarrass yourself. Right? I think there's an element of that, being embarrassed. That might be how we might describe this today. And in the present moment, he says, St. Thomas says, refraining from a vicious act through fear of reproach is blushing, in a sense. So it's a blushing. Why don't you do that bad thing? Why don't you gossip? Do something disgraceful? Because you're kind of you're afraid that somebody's going to find out. You're afraid your mother's going to find out, or people who you admire are going to find out that you did this bad thing, right? So you refrain from doing it. So in that way, it's a good thing. And also, if you the present moment, you also might try, if you're doing it, you might try to avoid the public eye. Um, you don't want other people to see what you're doing. It's that way you're ashamed. Now, is that great that you're trying to sneak behind people's back to do it? It's not. It's not great. It's better not to do it. But the fact that you know that it's wrong is still somewhat virtuous. If you think about nowadays, people steal things or they might do these awful things and then they put it on Snapchat or Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is that they put it on. They're not even ashamed that they're doing the terrible thing anymore. Right? Some things that people would do on Saturday night in the club at 2 o'clock in the morning, they'll put the video up on Monday at noon so everyone can see the thing they did at Saturday at midnight when they were drunk, right? They're not even ashamed of the thing they've done. So if one is at least ashamed, in some sense, it's a step in the right direction, right? If somebody tells a dirty joke and they blush, or they hear a dirty joke and they blush, it's at least a step in the right direction. If you say it or hear it and you don't even blush, then it lacks this type of shamefacedness, right? Shamefacedness is kind of that. It's a little bit of a voice of the conscience within us that tells us maybe you shouldn't be doing this or being part of this situation. So in this way, see, it's starting to build up now how this can be a virtue, right? Or could be an important part of temperance. So the third question is, are those who are closer to us more likely to make us shamefaced? This word he uses a lot is attestation, a person's attestation. Those who are close to us, connected with us, our close friends, people who we respect within our circles, they make us more shamefaced. And St. Thomas says, absolutely, yes, they do. Because if a stranger, right, if let's say you're driving down the street and this four-way stop and two people go at the same time and the person yells, it's very unclear who goes. We have rules to tell us who goes, but they're unclear what to do. They start yelling at each other, calling each other names. Now, do you take that personal? Well, not really, because the person doesn't know you, right? They don't know you. They don't know what's going on. They can say, idiot. Well, they don't know if you're an idiot or not. All they really know is that you might not be a great driver. So the opinions of strangers doesn't really matter that much in terms of making us ashamed. Now, if it's a person who's close to us, very, very close to us, as I said, and we say, you're an idiot, and you're a liar, and you're untrustworthy. Right? If that's coming from your spouse, your parent, that hurts more, right? That should embarrass you more because they really know you. Right? If a person who really knows you thinks you have bad character, that's different than if a stranger who doesn't even know you thinks you have bad character. The other part of it is that you see these people more frequently, right? So if there's just a traffic incident, and the person yells at you, you might be a little embarrassed, but you're never going to see the person again, most likely. Not very likely that you're going to see the person again, or if you do, you can avoid them. Versus if it's your own family members or close friends, you're going to see the person frequently. So if you did something really bad, something to be ashamed of, you have to keep seeing that person, and the shame continues, right? So in that way, is shamefacedness continues closer to those who are close to us. Now, the kind of exception to this is if the people who are close to us participate in our bad deeds, right? So if if you're a liar, but your spouse is also a liar, right? Let's say you go to stores and you steal together. Well, because you share in the vice, you don't share in the shame, right? In some ways, your bad deeds affirm one another's bad deeds, and it's not looked upon by either of you as disgraceful, right? So in that way, it's you can't trust just being close to determine if something is shamefaced. Really, the test would be is does an honorable person think that you are worthy of shame? That's the real judge of that. Now, can a virtuous person be ashamed? And this is the last article. And the answer is yes and no. So um, the two groups of people who don't feel shame are those who are so far gone that they don't feel shame, right? The first person is, say the person's a crook, the person's it has no virtue, they wouldn't know the right thing if it hit them in the head. Um, right? They don't feel shame because they don't even really think that what they're doing is wrong. So they're helpless causes in a sense. Of course, they're not really helpless, but manner of speech. Uh, they don't feel shame. Now, the other one is a person who is actually really virtuous. And they don't have anything to be ashamed of, right? A person who doesn't have many sins, and what sins they do have, they confess regularly. Right? The moment you walk out of the confessional and you do your penance, right? There's nothing to be ashamed of, right? You let it go. You've been forgiven from it. So a person who is virtuous and frequently confesses, they have very little to be ashamed of. Um, St. Thomas also says the old. Right? I think in the same way that he's using the old in terms of the elderly being wise. Right? They've seen a lot, they've done a lot, they're not making the same mistakes over and over again. I'm not sure if that's true today, but at the time that's what his view of older people are. Old folk, as he calls them, uh, has a certain level of prudence. They don't keep falling into the same traps over and over again because they see it coming. Therefore, they aren't shamed. Um, probably also that they're not going to be driven into the same passions of lust, the same passions after chasing after money and power and these things. When you're older, you're more comfortable, right? You're just going to be happy where you are at this point. The mindset. So they have less to be ashamed of. But he says they should still have shame. The shame is a virtuous hypothetically, which is, I think, a good line. If they were to do something that would be shameful, the shame is it's there, right? They could still experience shame if they did something that was necessary, but it exists within them as habitus in a hypothetical sense, but it's not something that they are living with daily because it's not something that they um, there's anything to be ashamed of. So in conclusion, shamefacedness is praiseworthy. It's a praiseworthy passion, and it's loosely a virtue. It's not kind of strictly a virtue the way that other things are virtues. And there's many ways in which shamefacedness, kind of embarrassment, isn't a virtue at all. It's just an emotion. If you slip and you fall on the ground and you are embarrassed, that's not really a virtue. Being embarrassed isn't a virtue. The moral sense, right? If it's something that you should be ashamed of morally, and you are, then it's a virtue. That kind of works on keeping us temperate, right? It works on building up that temperance. And shamefacedness is about disgraceful actions, right? It's not about shame of who you are, it's shame about something you did, right? You experience shame from your action. You experience more shamefacedness with those who are closer to us because they know us better and we have closer contact with them. The exception being is if they are equally as crooked as we are. If they encourage us in our badness, then they're not going to help us experience shame when we do something wrong. And virtuous people can be ashamed more in a hypothetical shame. Right? The shame is ready to be launched if necessary, but virtuous people typically don't experience shame because they don't have anything to be ashamed of. So that's a nice thing to have. And the recommendation then would be to live a virtuous life and go to confession frequently, so you have little to um, to experience shame about. But you can see it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because it's not something you want to avoid in some sense, right? Shame, you want to avoid it, but at the same time, it's a building block of what temperance is. So it's you want to have that hypothetical shame, right? Shamefacedness as a disposition, but not. You don't want to be frequently experiencing shame itself. I mean you've done something wrong. The next we will move on to honesty, which is the other integral part of temperance.